Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters, why disasters happen, and the factors that make them happen. We discuss vulnerability, or the underlying implicit factors that drive the effects of disasters. My name is Brady. I am your host. Today, we are discussing the tremors or earthquakes in Santorini, Greece, and the northern Australia, Queensland floods. A little bit of a two-parter episode today. I'm trying to kind of keep both of them short and to the point and discuss a few of the factors that are making both of these events somewhat notable and why and really exploring a bunch of the background factors and why they're so interesting. But before we get into that, the intent of exploring each of these disasters and others is not to demean or diminish the experiences of people who are facing these traumatic events, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why disasters happen. So, with that said, let's begin. So, welcome in. Today we are discussing the Greek Santorini earthquakes or tremors and the northern Queensland, Australia floods, February 13th. And got an interesting episode for you today. And then next week we're going to be looking at some of the possible changes to the United States and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the potential, reduction of FEMA or the dismantling of FEMA and the implications for the USA as a whole without having FEMA, basically. So that's kind of the teaser for next week. Hope you join me next Thursday. Today, we, again, are going to start with the earthquakes, and then we will proceed to the floods. And we're going to look at the background factors. Before I get into some of the vulnerabilities that are driving the effects of these disasters, we're actually going to look at how each event has unfolded. So we will start with the Greek islands, Santorini. If you have not been there or you have not seen it, Santorini is one of the major tourist destinations and islands within Greece. For reference, Greece has an economy that is partially based on tourism. Approximately 20% of their GDP is based on tourism, or 1 in 5 people have a job related to or with a tourist entity or a part of a tourist that can be influenced by tourists. So basically restaurants, tour guides, Airbnb hosts, things like that. So tourism is a huge part, and Santorini is one of these islands that has a huge host of tourists come in year to year. Santorini itself is also home to many Greeks, and there are many people who live there year round. There's also this third group of people who are the workers. Sometimes they are the transitory workers who might live in Athens on the mainland of Greece, and then they go out for the summers to work during the tourist season. So there's a number of different groups apart and in Santorini that we're going to kind of discuss as a part of it. What's interesting is whenever you Google Santorini or Greek earthquakes 2025, a lot of the results actually come up for earthquakes in Santorini, but a little bit of a misconception. So Santorini is basically a larger, island. And the earthquakes that have occurred since January 27th, which is now going on about 2 to 3 weeks, as of today, February 13th, are occurring northeast of the island. And they are occurring near a submarine volcano. And that becomes important for a discussion we'll have in a little bit. But the earthquakes are not directly happening, or they're not directly happening on Santorini. They're happening near, and that actually influences the type of risk that could possibly happen. Oftentimes earthquakes, as we discussed in last week's episode in Kahramanmaraş, Turkey, when an earthquake is closer to the surface, but also near buildings, near basically soil, land space. It's going to have direct, closer effects compared to an earthquake that is happening under the Mediterranean Sea. It is going to have different risks. So an underwater earthquake is actually it could potentially cause a tsunami. And that is one of the greater risks to the people who live on Santorini. But then again, there's also the direct risk of an earthquake occurring to Santorini residents or people who are living there, visiting, etc. The earthquakes are a cause for concern, and they could definitely destroy old buildings. They could destroy a lot of the infrastructure, pools, roads. But one of the concerns with Santorini is its geography. It actually is a very mountainous island where there's a bunch of hills and then a lot, basically rocks that there's a threat of landslides and rock slides. And a few communities, such as Persia on the eastern part of the island, that are actually prone and are near cliffs. So not only is there the threat of an earthquake, also a tsunami, and then rock slides as well. So the threats are real, and the difficulty of an earthquake is that they occur so quickly that there is no real warning when there is a significant earthquake. You don't have hours like you would for a storm or a hurricane, things like that. Earthquakes, they occur very rapidly, and then depending on the magnitude, or we're looking at the Richter scale or the modified Mercalli scale, the effects could be devastating. So that's the difficulty, and the difficult part of the potential risk is that there could be a large-scale earthquake directly to Santorini or directly around Santorini and the surrounding islands. So what has Greece done and the Greek government? Let's talk about that, and that's kind of will relay and that will relate to some of the vulnerabilities within Santorini itself. The Greek government has actually declared a state of emergency for Santorini for this week, and from what I've read, it will remain in place until the beginning of March. And that's really important. What that does is it gives them the ability to make unilateral decisions, but also provide funding. So at the beginning of the episode, I talked about Santorini is a major tourist destination. And under this new emergency or state of emergency, businesses actually have the right to suspend workers' contracts until the end of the emergency. However, layoffs during this time are prohibited, which is an interesting point, as you might have remembered from Hurricane Helene and our discussion on some of the economic vulnerabilities. Is there's a difficult time for workers. There's a difficult decision for workers. Some of them wanted to evacuate, but some were risk losing their jobs, or they feared losing their jobs if they did evacuate and leave work. Whereas people on Santorini, businesses can suspend their work, but they cannot be laid off. And that's an important distinction. So businesses also need to be able to retain the same number of jobs as before the emergency. And that's actually from the local authorities in Santorini and the government of Greece. But the other interesting aspect is frontline workers and workers who have their contracts suspended during this state of emergency are also entitled for state compensation of up to about 530 euros in cash payments. So this is a pretty huge step, in my opinion, and it's a step in the right direction for ensuring the safety of citizens, but then also, maintaining and making sure that that workers and businesses aren't affected, and the government has some ability to assist those workers. So the next point I want to discuss is the two volcanoes that are nearby Santorini, because there's been a lot of discussion on them online, and then there's questions about the linkage between earthquakes and volcanoes. And I will say it right away, there's not definitive evidence to suggest that earthquakes can cause a volcanic eruption. And there's a lot of literature supporting that, but then also conflicting. There are two major, I guess you could say, volcanoes around Santorini. One of them being the big caldera, which erupted, I believe, in 1956. And it's actually visible from many of the communities in Santorini, and it's you can actually go and visit it if you want to. And this is actually part of the concern is that, well, what if this volcano erupts? The caldera, which is near Santorini, the Santorini caldera, is not actually the problematic volcano that people are worried about. The earthquakes themselves are actually occurring near the Colombo submarine volcano, which is northeast of Santorini. Now, there's a whole bunch of literature that I read and that I'll digest for folks. So, number one, supposedly both the Santorini caldera, which was one of the volcanoes that erupted and disrupted the Minoan civilization in 1650 BC. That's part of the one that you can actually see from the cities in Santorini, such as Oya and others. The Santorini caldera is actually connected to the Colombo submarine volcano through an underground channel, basically, where they share lava. So, basically, there's systems underneath that carry magma, and then basically there's like a reserve underneath where magma will build up and expand. And then as the expansion of magma, gases and lava and such begins to build up, that's when you see eruptions. With that said, there's a 2022 article that I've read and I still have a lot of questions about, and I don't think it's right to take it at face value. It's probably worth doing a bit more research on, but it suggests that there's a new data imagery topology or topography science, basically a way to determine if there's active magma underneath the volcano that is rising or expanding or accumulating. And so these scientists in 2022 basically said, well, in the Colombo submarine volcano, this is actually the case, and we are actually seeing an expansion of magma. And what they call for is advanced metrics in determining if there is magma. Whereas others have said, no, that's not the case. There's good systems in place to determine if there is a buildup of magma, and so on. So that is to say that, there's no definitive volcanic eruption that we can tell is going to happen. But I think it's just relevant to talk about it for a minute because there's oftentimes that lots of people ask if they are related and so on. So, and we also have to remember that earthquakes are caused because of tectonic plates. Huge pieces of the Earth's crust are pulled apart, pushed together, and slide past each other. And that's what really causes earthquakes. And that's what's causing these tremors. So, talking about some of the vulnerabilities of Santorini, because it's a really interesting question. You have a very high-profile tourist island in Greece that is well-visited and well-traveled and well-photographed, I guess you could say. One of the interesting elements is this remoteness and being an island. So islandness entails a certain almost self-reliance, self-sufficiency that people on a mainland might not have similar sense to. A lot of things are shipped to and from the island of Santorini. And, that will often inflate prices and do all that kind of stuff. But what it means is that there's only a certain amount of things getting onto the island and a certain amount of people coming off and items coming off. So this remoteness is actually a huge component and vulnerability that I actually think the Greek government did a really good job of managing as these tremors were occurring in the early onset in January 27th. There was approximately 11,000 locals, the people who are working there temporarily, visitors who have since January 27th departed from the island as a result of the earthquakes and tremors. And I think the Greek government's messaging, and if you look at part of their website, they actually have a whole bunch of information on earthquakes, and they make it easy to digest. So I think they did a good job of actually reducing the vulnerability of that remoteness and of, only being able to get off the island via boat and some flying off, right? But I think they did a good job. And what's more is they've actually started to begin discussing evacuation plans for all of the residents if there is increases in the earthquakes or they do get to a higher magnitude. And then also issuing a few warnings, which, let's go through a few of them. All pool owners are required to drain their pools because water movements could actually destabilize buildings. Making sure that you cannot go, or they're basically instructing police officers and telling people to not go into old buildings. And that's an important one because, again, talked about like in last week's episode, older buildings and falling buildings are the things that kill people during an earthquake. Not necessarily the earthquake itself, but falling buildings. And then what's more, the Greek authorities have actually restricted some areas as high risk, which is really interesting. Whether it is near the coastlines or the shorelines, or areas near a rock slide that could potentially happen from a rock slide. And all this says to me is that the Greek emergency management officials, I think it's the Hellenistic Emergency Department in like English. I don't know the Greek term for it. All it says to me is that they have a good understanding of where particular hazards are going to occur in an area if there is an earthquake. And that is a sign of preparedness to me. And also being able to action a whole bunch of these items, restricting areas so people can't go there in case of the buildings, not going on coastlines, and ensuring that people have the right information so that they're aware and prepared, and making sure that they're safe, not only tourists, but the residents that live there. And I think overall, we're going to see, I suspect, a few more series of tremors and earthquakes, maybe even a larger one. But as it stands, the Greek government has done a really good job of monitoring and telling people what to do thus far. So now we move to northern Queensland's floods in Australia. So northern Queensland is in the northeast part of Australia. They have the Great Coral Reef, the Great Barrier Reef, just next door to a lot of these places that are flooding. One of the particular cities we are going to talk about is Townsville. And one of the primary drivers, just as we talked about for the Greek islands, in Townsville and northern Queensland, is this remoteness or isolation. And it has particularly come about as a result of flooded roadways. So talking about some of the context of how the floods in northern Queensland have unfolded, on February 2nd, there's been a recorded 1 meter or 40 inches of rain in approximately over 48 hours. One resident who's near Townsville noted that it was 600 millimeters of rain in 12 hours. So in previous episodes, we've had a few metrics just to kind of help people visualize how much water or how much rainfall that is. 40 inches is almost 3 times the amount that Hurricane Helene dumped in Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville received 13.98 inches of rain in the span of 2 days. And for reference, we use the illustration of that would go up to your knee or just above your knee if you're 5'10" human being. But effectively, it is a massive dump of water. So much so that a number of towns and the city of Townsville have been cut off due to the collapse of bridges and then just the flooding of roadways. Not only is there a cutoff of critical supplies, but there's also power, which was out from Tuesday to Friday in the afternoon. And the flood started on February 2nd and were periodically, basically last Sunday. And from Tuesday to Friday, so the 4th to the 7th, people had sporadic power. And over the course of the 9th, 10th, and 11th of February, there has also been a number of floods. But effectively, this has been a series of floods which has hit a bunch of different smaller towns and larger cities that have caused a number of damages. And again, the damages are not like linear. They're not all the same. There's different roadways which are damaged, the bridges that are collapsed. There's also instances of tombstones in cemeteries that are washed away or damaged. But then there's also the secondary issue of if water remains in a home or a building long enough, it causes mold. And mold is an extremely difficult and costly thing to get rid of. If it turns from regular mold, which is bad, to black mold, it can be deadly and toxic. And they require different mechanisms to basically remove them. And so all of these components, they really are influenced by the immediacy of being able to respond and provide relief. So if we cannot stabilize the flooding itself, or we can't get resources to people that need it, well, we run the risk of having the damages even worse. And then the secondary effect of we run the risk of water staying in buildings longer and those buildings being more and more damaged. So the speed at which we respond is really, really important, especially when it comes to floods and just any other disaster in general or any other hazard in general. The secondary thing that is starting to be spoke about is our favorite topic, insurance. There is a number of reports stating that people are really worried that their house is not going to be insurable after an event like this. And they are worried that they're not going to be able to cover or get insurance for any sort of flooding damage or rainfall damage after this. And that is a serious question that is being posed all around the world. Given insurance is a business and they are looking to operate on, 5 to 10% profit thresholds for a particular policy, if an event or a hazard starts to occur every year and is costly and really difficult to mitigate, reduce, basically prevent for a house or for a building, a structure, then it becomes not necessarily cost inducive to do that. And people or insurance companies begin to say, well, we don't really want to carry this risk anymore. So that's a long-term and difficult question that is certainly going to be asked more and more as we go into the future. But talking about some of the vulnerabilities, I've already mentioned a few. There is a remoteness to, there's an isolation. There was an isolation. And this has kind of a multiple effect. So resources, logistics, already talked about, it's slower and relief is limited. But then there's also the element of restoration for buildings, but then also for farms and food security. And there's an interesting article, I think it's by The Guardian, and it actually interviews a number of farmers in northern Queensland, and it looks at food security issues. There's a number of crops that are grown in northern Queensland and that are at risk for going up in price due to the fact that they're going to be losing a number of their crops and their harvest. I actually think it's some sort of cane and sugar cane. I'm totally blanking on the exact thing it is. Regardless, the destruction of one bridge, and the bridge was to Townsville, which is a city in northern Queensland, has really disrupted a lot of the logistics and really forced Northern Queensland Premier, the province/state, to consider how are we going to evacuate, how are we going to provide immediate relief, and then how are we also going to stabilize the long-term economics and then just well-being of our people going forward. So not too much on Northern Queensland because there's still a bunch of information I want to verify before we fully dive more into it. But quickly recapping today's episode. Santorini and the earthquakes are a really interesting event that is still ongoing. A number of small tremors have the potential to have a number of different cause a number of different secondary disasters. If a larger earthquake occurs in the ocean, in the sea, there could be the possibility of tsunami. If it occurs on Santorini's island itself, the potential for falling buildings, but then also rock slides. The Greek government itself has a number of measures already in place to ensure that their workers, businesses can have some level of stability, but then also initiating evacuations for tourists, but also the transitory population who work there. So, and then this idea of remoteness, the islandness, having resources that have to be shipped there for relief. And then also having an understanding of the risks and being prepared. Whereas when we look at Northern Queensland, a number of floods which are devastating and cut off roadways and a primary bridge, the cutting off the bridge on the Bruce Highway is what it is particularly. But then also, having the water sit in a building, house, long periods of time because there's no immediate relief. There might be less contractors being able to get out there and assist in the immediate. So I hope you found today's episode interesting. It was definitely interesting previewing or going over vulnerabilities in two different countries that are far apart and have quite different geographic situations, one being an island, one being Northern Australia, and seeing the similarities between the two. Next week, we're doing a little bit of a different overview and talking about basically the importance of FEMA or what FEMA actually does. And that is going to be a really interesting topic that I'm quite excited to dive into. So if you have any disasters you want explored or any ideas that you have, always open to exploring them and understanding kind of why they're happening and the underlying vulnerabilities that are ongoing. But for today, if you could subscribe, also share this podcast with others, I'd greatly appreciate it. And you can reach me at catastrophepodcast@gmail.com if you want any sort of disaster explored. And with that, that's all I got for today. Thanks.